The Six is a documentary about the 6 Chinese survivors of the Titanic. It was produced by Oscar-winning director James Cameron and is scheduled for release in China later this week on the 109th anniversary of the Titanic sinking. The Six focuses on the racism the Chinese on board the Titanic faced while on the ship, on the lifeboats, and when they arrived even in New York. In 1912, the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in force in the United States, and the Chinese survivors disappeared from the pages of history until now. I got a chance to speak to Arthur Jones, the filmmaker and director of The Six, to help us understand how the traumatic experience of The Six precedes contemporary racism towards Asian Americans. Take a look. Arthur, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Years of efforts.
I think it's about 6 years now, yeah. It's funny because the last film I made took 6 years. The one before that took 7 years. And I said to myself, I'm just going to keep taking a year off each time and maybe we'll make the films quicker. And this one, we kind of finished it around 5 years. But then, of course, the cinemas were all shut down for a while. And so we only got it out after 6. So it seems like 6 years is my natural
What
pace.
is it like, 1 year after the production is done, to look at it again?
It's a really good question. I mean, I watched it at the premiere last night, and I got a chance to see it on the big screen again. And it's a film, in a way, it is of course a documentary, and I'm proud of making a documentary, but it's also a film.
There were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic. 6 of them survived. They are unique among the other passengers in the sense that they are the least welcome.
And we designed it to work in a cinema. And the sound is beautiful. And our composer is a film music composer. And we shot it in beautiful 4K. And it looks amazing on the big screen. But there were a couple of scenes last night that I remember that when we were editing, I was a little bit, I was a little bit like, not sure if we should put it in or not, and does it work? And coming back to the film a year later, the 2 that were, one of them I really was unsure whether we should use it, and people had questioned. The other one was a scene I always liked. But watching it last night, I could really feel, goosebumps coming up.
What are these scenes?
The 2 scenes I'm talking about, one of them is a scene where we get Stephen Schrankert, our lead researcher, and he was the co-creator of this project with me. We get him to do what they call a human endurance test. So we put him in a very cold swimming pool.
That's what you do to your partner, isn't it?
I like to see him suffer. We put him in a very cold swimming pool with a thermometer deep inside him and measure his body temperature while he sits in very cold water.
Right.
And I did it partly for the science. It's interesting to see what happens to the human body. But I also did it because I wanted Stephen to have a kind of gauge for what it would have been like to be those people in the water. Because it's really hard to imagine that experience. We can just think, oh, it would have been horrible, or it feels cold or something. But being in water that is 1 or 2 degrees.
It's not an adjective.
Yeah, it's something profoundly visceral. And if you can take an audience into that, I like to take the audience into the experience through, in this case, our researchers' body language and their facial expressions. I want the audience to feel like they're invested in the investigation, that when there's a disappointment, they feel it as well. And when we find something, it's extra special. We don't use guns and car chases. We use like dusty documents and telephone calls to another country on a different time zone, and a telephone book trying to find someone's name, or these kind of things are our guns and car chases. But you have to see it through the expression on the face of people now. So I never wanted to make a history documentary that was just about archive footage and then some sort of sonorous voice of God voiceover that tells you exactly what happened for sure. I wanted to make something that expressed uncertainty and a journey where you don't know what the end is. Because we didn't know what the end was. You know, this project began with 2 pieces of paper, a list of passengers and a list of survivors. And through that, we knew there were 8 Chinese passengers on Titanic, and 6 of them survived. And that's all we had.
History is about editing. Nobody knows every moment for everyone throughout history. So are you confident your version of editing is closest, at least to the extent that you can, to history?
I am confident that no one has ever been closer, and that we have found out more correct information than anyone has ever found before.
Was it easy to find the correct information?
First of all, I think we should think about what correct means. I think you're always trying to move, well, you're moving closer to something that the evidence suggests is true. But getting to 100% is always going to be tough, which is why I like to tell my story through people now. Because when they have a doubt, you can see it. When they're sure, you can see it. But if you just watch a film and it tells you everything's true, then what's the point? It's already decided it. Why make a film? You know, you might as well just read the book with the facts in.
Doubt is a beautiful part of it.
I think it's a beautiful part. But I think it's something that people certainly when we were filming in China, some people said to us, you know, what if you got something wrong? But I think from their angle, I think that's the worst thing that could happen. That's not the worst thing that could happen. For me, the worst thing is we don't find anything. Actually, we get something wrong. I don't think we have. I think we got it right. But I always want to be honest enough to express doubt and uncertainty. And here's the document we found. Can we trust it? I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let's see where that takes us.
Because the story, when it came to you, it started from uncertainty and doubts.
I mean, that's really all it started with. If you want to talk about facts, we had 8 names, 8 ages. I'll give you an example. The names, I think 3 of them changed the spelling when they were rescued 4 days later. I think 4 of the 8 ages changed. So, you know, they gained 4 years in 4 days or something. I mean, it's so unreliable. You don't know where to begin. The names themselves, they're written in the English, you know, in the alphabet. It's ABCs. It's not written in Chinese. In 1912, there's no pinyin. What's the system for writing it down? Who wrote it down? Was it a British sailor on the ship as they came on? Was it a ticket official? Was somebody copying from something? Was it one of the Chinese guys just told someone all the other names? Was it one of the Chinese guys wrote it down? All of these are things that we spent months and months considering and trying to work out. You start with nothing, and then piece by piece it comes together like an incredibly complicated jigsaw that you know you can't possibly finish, but you're just trying to get as much of it done as you can.
You had 5 years of your own jigsaw, while at the same time trying to piece together their jigsaw. So what happened to these people, many would wonder, who have not yet watched the movie?
Well, the 6, in a nutshell, they were working men. They worked on boats. They worked on ships. We knew that they'd gone through the UK. That's how they'd started off their journey. And they ended up on Titanic together.
Titanic, it is a Chinese story. They were kind of shuffled off and hidden, you know, kind of expunged from records, so on.
Those stories are very well documented for almost every single one of those survivors. But the Chinese are almost uniquely unknown.
He may have been the last one that was saved. That became the inspiration for how Rose was saved.
The last person rescued from Titanic is Chinese.
Where did they go? What happened to them?
They deserve to tell their story as much as any other survivors do.
Yeah, but that immediately, you ask the question, well, just because they're Chinese and on a ship together, do they know each other? Are they friends? Are they brothers?
And why were they there?
Why were they there? And all these questions. And some of these questions you find...
And why did they start from the UK?
Why did they start from the UK? Yeah. Well, did they start from the UK? Did they... Was it just by chance? They're just on a journey. They happen to be in the UK. So all of these things are things that we answered. But how we answer the questions as we met them is very variable. Sometimes it was about individual information we had about them and what they like to do. Or
give me an example.
An example would be in 1912, they were on Titanic. 6 of them survived. They ended up being they arrived in New York. they were put by immigration officials onto a ship that they were due to work on anyway. But they were treated very differently from the other survivors who were all looked after and put up in hotels. These guys were kept on board the rescue ship overnight, written about very badly in the press, and the next day they were sort of, there were actually newspaper reports that said, essentially, don't worry, we'll get rid of them tomorrow. I mean, it was awful. I mean, when you read this, and it's just, it's just unimaginable.
Did they say why? They want to get rid of this?
First of all, there was a lot of basic prejudice against Chinese people. So the idea that Chinese people could kind of wander free, come into New York and wander into the country was something that a lot of people, for many reasons, had issues with. Mostly political reasons why Chinese were scapegoats, why they were the ones. It was easy to kind of blame one community for a set of problems. The economy's not doing well, and some, white Americans are out of work. Well, what's an easier way to explain that than not the economy's being run badly or something? But it's these guys that are taking your jobs, Get one set of poor people to blame another set of poor people is easier than getting it's less risky than getting poor people to blame the people who are running the system. And I mean, we see that again and again in the world. That's not an uncommon way of doing it. So I think they were just the scapegoats for a while. I mean, it's happened to many communities at that particular time, and in different ways right up to the present day. The Asian community, the diaspora of Chinese and other Asian communities, has been a target for these kind of things. What happened to them next is they got onto a boat. They ended up working for 2 or 3 years on that ship, and they gradually spread out as they followed their own paths, and they ended up being in the US and Canada and the UK. And we were talking about whether it's an individual detail that took them somewhere or a history reason. Because often we would lose them. We don't know where they went, or we don't know where one of them went. And then sometimes we had to go back and kind of read the wider history. Where is it likely that they would go? Because they could be anywhere, So where is it likely? So for example, we know that in 1912, why were they going to the US? They weren't going to immigrate into the US. They were going to work because in the UK in 1912, there was a coal strike and the shipping industry was being affected. There was no fuel to run the ships. So these shipping companies would often send their workers to work on different lines so they could keep them working. So they sent these guys over to the US to work on fruit boats and cargo vessels up and down usually the east coast of the US, from New York, down Baltimore, and down that coast, right the way down past Florida into the Caribbean, into Cuba, and then they'd come up and down delivering fruit and things like that, working that ship. And then we would find them through shipping records. But in 1914, 2 years later, some of them started to disappear, and the number of Chinese men working on shipping began to reduce on the US coast, and you find them turning up back in Europe again. Why? Well, because the First World War has broken out. A lot of European and British sailors who worked in the merchant navy were being drafted into the navy to work in gunboats and battleships and so on. And so you still need the merchant navy to get food and imports and exports. And so a lot of Chinese workers were invited to come and work on those ships. Incredibly dangerous work, because effectively you're working in war zones with torpedoes and submarines and lots of danger. Many of them died working incredibly bravely on those ships because it was work. It was an opportunity to do it. And I think some of them believed in it. It was an important thing to do. They felt they were doing the right thing. And so they did that for a few years. And then in 1918, the war ended. What happened then is that a lot of communities, especially in Britain, but in the US too, often the local union, local government would say, now what are we going to do with these guys? We got all these Chinese guys living here. We got our guys that are coming home. Can we get rid of them somehow? And in the US and Canada, they had laws that they would use to protect industries and so on. We know the very famous, the Pai Hua Fan, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was used to reduce immigration from Chinese people almost to nothing for a long time, 60 years or so. Canada had similar laws. The UK, you might look at it on the face. I mean, I'm English, You might look at it and say, oh, we didn't have those laws. But actually, we had other kind of insidious ways of keeping out communities we didn't want. Essentially, in 1912, if you were Chinese, you wouldn't even have the hope of immigrating into the UK. There was no system to do that. And when they wanted to get rid of Chinese workers, they would find other methods to get rid of them. Sometimes commercial. They'd work with the shipping companies, get a whole bunch of Chinese sailors to work on a contract, taking cargo, say, back to Hong Kong or something. They'd get to Hong Kong, and then they wouldn't sign them back up again. And the Chinese guys couldn't stay in the UK without a work contract. So all sorts of ways were used to control their lives. And many of them were married to local women in the UK. There are children of those Chinese sailors, often with British wives, from that generation, whose fathers just disappeared. They never knew what happened to them.
Looking at history like this, does it make you have more hope about us? I mean, us in general?
I think it's just my character. Maybe it suits documentaries. I'm not really focused on the result. You know, we set out 6 years ago to make this film. I didn't know what we'd find. You know, honestly, I had no idea. It's not like we had a script that told us where everything was going to go. So for me, it's all about process. And my process is that we make films about trying to uncover things and uncover mystery. I think what do they say? The sunlight is the best antiseptic. You know, you expose something, you talk about it, you bring it out into the open. So that for me is why something like this story, that there were Chinese people on Titanic whose story was never told, is important to tell it. It's not just to fix the textbooks. It's because we're reinserting a national story into a global story. And that has to be important. Even if at some points it's uncomfortable, there are difficult things to say. Even now we have this very important, you know, Stop Asian Hate movement, the Yayi, you know, that we're talking about now in the US and the UK and all over the world. It's painful to go through that discussion, but it's the first step to reveal it and to talk about it. Because I think 20 years ago when I was first in China, I came to discover that it was a thing. There's a lot of prejudice around against people of different nations, not just against Chinese people. There's lots of prejudice around. And of course, I became aware of the prejudice and discrimination against, you know, against Asians living in different countries around the world. You know about it. You know if you are Asian, or if you live here. But a lot of other people didn't know, and they would just talk about the cliches of an Asian community. Oh, they do very well in business, or you know, they're smart and this hardworking, and all of these things which are kind of
can be interpreted both ways.
Yes,
depending on the time.
It's sort of it's a kind of it's a reverse kind of situation where it feels like it's a compliment, but there's something written into it that's not a compliment. It's uncomfortable, and so we can observe these things. But I think beginning to question those cliches, the stereotypes, the idea that you know, that Chinese immigrants or Asian immigrants are the quiet minority, or they just get on with things, they don't make a fuss. I think those things are all worth examining and talking about. And we found the way in this film to touch on an issue that we initially thought might just be about a boat or a ship and the people on board and how did they escape and what door did they go through. But over time, the story did what I always hoped it would, which is that it began to touch on issues that still affect us on a macro level and a micro level. On a macro level, society-wide, these still affect us, and we know because we're talking about it, and it makes people uncomfortable, but we still have to talk about it. And on a micro level, because the characters in our film, including the son of Feng Long, who's the survivor we know most about, we discovered over time that there was a break in his family. There was a twist in his family that was separating him and his father, that was keeping his father has long gone, but during his lifetime he just didn't know his father that well. And it was not just a story of a quiet man who doesn't tell his story. There were reasons, some of them very big reasons, why he in particular, but that generation of immigrants kept a lot of secrets, kept a lot of things in their hearts and didn't tell people. And so I think the chance to open that box and begin to talk about it, for me, that's a process issue. We don't quite know where it's going to go, but I think it's important to open the box and look inside and start to talk about it.
Wonderful story. And I guess for you also a wonderful journey, Congratulations once again, Arthur.
Thank you so much.
The 6th.
Thank you.